Hi, this is Dr. Cesar Oliva with another episode of the Way to College podcast. And I was sharing with my guest, today's guest, that I was just writing an article. Somebody asked me to write an article on the power of storytelling and on my work. And yeah, I never anticipated where the podcast would take me. But in many ways, it's a journey that I think started as an undergraduate. And collecting oral histories and listening to stories, but then being able to share them and to tell the stories of others. It, in my case, it was through research papers and journal articles, and today it's a podcast. And so I'm always excited about hearing the stories that folks share with me, because it's always new. It's always somebody new that I haven't met often, and today is another one of those opportunities. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to let my guests introduce themselves. All right, Dorotea, would you mind introducing yourself to our listeners out there?
Well, good morning, Jay. Thank you so much for having me. And my name is Dorotea Reyna, and I'm the author of the recently published book, Los Cedros, a Tejana Memoir.
Dorotea, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for joining me. As with all of my guests, I always ask my guests if they had to identify a starting point for their educational journey, where would that starting point be for you?
For me, my starting point would be the 6 years I spent at St. Paul's Catholic Elementary School in Mission, Texas. They were very formative years. And with your permission, I would like to read a small part of my book where I describe that experience because I think it sets up the rest of my educational journey.
Absolutely.
So this is from chapter 4, titled Girl. And people might ask why I speak in the third person. And that's because even my character in this book of 12 vignettes, focusing on different characters of my pueblo, is just one person out of this community. So this is my story. Her parents' choice of schooling created the first fissure in the girl's psyche. Between that period of her life when she felt whole and unbroken, and the subsequent period where she would always see the world as divided into two. Spanish was her first language, although she never remembered the time her parents described when she sang in Spanish. At some point in her very young consciousness, her parents began speaking to her almost exclusively in English, and thereafter she was always careful to distinguish and separate the two idiomas. Even at the age of 5, she had already divined the magical potency of language and was careful not to intertwine these two exclusive powers, these competing kingdoms, Spanish and English. Her discovery of the sorcery of language was fueled by the set of encyclopedias her parents had purchased from a traveling salesman. 12 leather-bound volumes, maroon and white with gilt letters. The first 3 volumes for children, the latter 9 for adults, including history, science, and psychology. At what age she fell into the pool of fairy tale and rhyme in the children's volumes, he could not remember. But when language, especially poetry, pulled her into its embrace, she was never again to let go. Her father read to the children at night, sending them off to sleep with delightful music played on a small record player. He was a modern, educated man and knew how to sharpen and grow young minds through music and storytelling. At some point, she began reading the fairy tale and poetry books on her own and spent countless hours bewitched by the colorful and fanciful illustrations of queens and castles, princes and dragons, and fair-haired shepherd boys in villages so distant from her own, yet so close. She liked to recite poems under her breath, loving the lilt of the lines as they converged in meaning. Going to school with so many white children, the sons and daughters of store owners and farmers, was like stepping into one of her fairy tales. It was another world, a world which terrified her a little, with teachers who were tall and some stern. It was a time when the paddle swung freely and also the ruler, the latter used to wrap open palms as a punishment for Mexican children who unconsciously slipped into Spanish. She was never punished this way, for she had learned to separate these two languages well before she entered first grade. So began 6 long years of learning the secrets of the alphabet and numbers, of reading and writing essays, and of diagramming sentences. She excelled academically early on and never wavered, for along with her dreamy imagination, which she kept to herself, concentration was her constant companion, almost a genie she could summon at will. Unlike the other children who got into trouble for wiggling or getting out of their desks or not keeping their hands and feet to themselves, she was always at one with the lesson before her. Eventually, she came to prefer writing essays above all other assignments, making visible the dreamy habits of her imagination as she compared and contrasted the pinks of the dawn with the rosy orange of the skies at sunset. Yet she was equally faithful to her arithmetic lesson, carefully lining up the numbers in multiplication or division, waiting for the right answer, which clicked in her ear like a little clasp.
I love that. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
So tell me more about this, because I think you allude to so many things in that experience, in that passage, in those passages, but I feel like there's so much to unpack there.
Thank you.
And before we jumped on, started recording, you talked about, you told me you were going to read this, but you talked specifically about language. And so maybe we start with the language, or start wherever you'd like. But tell us about the importance of the relevance of this story and your own journey.
Well, I should say that my earliest teachers were my parents, because both of my parents were teachers. And they were the first of their families and communities in South Texas, in Hidalgo County, in their little pueblos in which they grew, to earn bachelor's degrees and later master's degrees. And after becoming teachers, they were also administrators. So their careers and professions grew as I continued my schooling. But as I write, my parents had bought a set of encyclopedias, and they did so because they wanted to encourage us to learn and to read. And my father, especially, perhaps because my mother had we had such a large family. I was the oldest of 7. She was
Wow.
always busy. She was a teacher, and then she'd have to do all the housewife and mothering. So my father often was the one that spent time with us and tried to encourage us to learn. And I remember him, as I write about, reading to us before we went to bed. But very early on, I loved language. I was very keenly aware of it. And right before even I went to St. Paul's Catholic Elementary, my kindergarten, I had a brief stint in a school where French was also spoken. We learned the song, Alouette, gentil alouette. I had no idea it was about threatening a lark with plucking its feathers. But, even then I was exposed to another language, French. And I adored language. And when I started reading fairy tales and poetry on my own, just the rhythm of language, the fact that you could combine imagination with storytelling, with music in a short space, it just entranced me because it also had meaning. So I was very, very aware of language even before I entered school. And truly, the nuns at St. Paul's Catholic Elementary got me all the way up to Stanford, for sure, because it was back in the day where memorization was a big part of what we did, but actually memorization is a big part of learning. So, and also such arts that have been lost as diagramming sentences, where you really got very close into the interstices of language. How is sentences put together? Those were great boons to me and gave me a very good foundation for the rest of my life. But there was also the shadow of being punished for speaking Spanish. And so for a sensitive child, as I was, the oldest of seven, eager to please, eager to be considered good, there was that pang, that something about my very culture, my very nature, if you will, was wrong, was not as good as. So while I credit my teachers, the nuns for getting me to Stanford English or giving me the good education that my parents had wanted, there was also the pang of feeling not good enough, being reinforced very, very early on. So that it, no surprise, throughout the years, I lost mastery of Spanish while I attained mastery in English.
Your story resonates. We talked before about the similarities with our journeys, our respective journeys. And I grew up in a time after, I think, where we saw the students were punished
Yeah.
for speaking Spanish.
Yeah.
But my parents, that was their experience, and they didn't want me speaking Spanish. And so, I never had a firm grasp. I think I found myself, so much of my story is kind of of recapturing a lost education, right? Um, and so I'm fascinated by your own experiences with this, being in it, and I think what really piqued my interest was, what does that do for you? And I forget how you described it, right? But you said that along the way you started to lose your mastery of Spanish. Um, I don't know if you said insecurity. Um, can you speak to what was that like for you, like losing that and recognizing? Did you recognize, here you are, you're losing this mastery of of your native language?
Well, I have to go back and say it wasn't a mastery, because when I entered first grade, I was 6 or 7 years old. So I had that level of knowledge of Spanish. But my parents said that I used to sing in Spanish, and I certainly don't remember that. Um, and, back in the day, and this was probably, I'm 20 years older than you are, so it is a whole generation. The nuns made sure, they were white nuns, they made sure that there was never going to be any shows of overt racism in the classroom, for which I'm grateful. But, there were very noticeably more powerful Anglo families that were part of that Catholic community. Um, there were feelings of, Anglos are superior to Mexicans, therefore we punish you for speaking your language. So those things were excruciating, I think, because I came from a Mexican pueblo right on the river itself, and that's, what I write about 500 people, and it was exclusively Mexican except for the Border Patrol, which occupied a tiny corner of the pueblo. They kind of kept to themselves. And so my parents chose, even though they were both teachers in the public schools and taught Chicano students, they chose a Catholic school where half the students were white, the other half Mexican, but all the teachers were white. And they did so because they had struggled so mightily in college to give presentations in English because they were Spanish dominant. So to make sure that we succeeded in this society, they made the very conscious decision to send us to a school where English would become our primary language. And we had had older cousins, go through this Catholic school. The girls had inherited the pleated skirts, which by the time we got them had no pleats in them. They were pretty much worn and darned. And my parents paid, I believe at that time it was $13 a child, um, a month to get us educated. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but at one point we had 4 children enrolled there. And it was a lot for my parents because teachers were not paid a lot. But my parents made the very conscious and I would say political decision to send us to a place where we could acquire mastery in English. And that's what indeed happens. And they also wanted us to be introduced and reinforced in the Catholic faith. The church, the St. Paul's Catholic Church, was right adjacent to the school. So at least once a week, we would go and, get catechism and go to mass and, be indoctrinated into the faith. We also had the pastor of the church visit the classrooms. And I remember he was white, Father Dan. We would all drop to our knees as soon as he entered the classroom, and we would go up to him. And it sounds odd now, but we would kiss his opal ring, as a sign of respect. So again, it sounds extreme to our ears now, but actually, Jay, I'm very grateful to my parents for exposing me not only to the best education they could provide, but also to the Catholic faith, because it taught me the morals and values that, were so instrumental to me for the rest of my life. And nowadays, parents send their kids many times to public schools, secular schools. And I went to public school in junior high and high school, so I'm aware of that. But necessarily, you can't bring religion into it. So how do you impart values? And, that problem was solved entirely by sending me to Catholic school. And it's those morals and values that my parents taught me and that were reinforced by the school that kind of drive the social uh, drive for justice that, is the fire for my book. Because my book is about the beautiful little pueblo that I was from on the river. And going back right before I started writing this book in 2021, I went back to visit and I saw that my father's village was under surveillance. It was now under a giant surveillance balloon. And my mother's village was now framed by the wall. And it was the shocking realization of how militarized the border had become in the valley that was the fire that kind of helped me write this book. And my book is a love letter to my little pueblos that I grew up in and the good people that helped raise me. The activist priests that, lived right next to our home, the curandera that lived right next to him, the various people that had such a hand in shaping my life and my siblings' lives, and what good people they were. And now to find that cradle of my childhood Eden under surveillance was a shock, was a severe shock. And that realization that the border has changed so much since my childhood, growing up in the 60s, was part of the fire that helped me write this book.
I love that. Your parents, and thank you for explaining that, right? That why your parents chose to send you to the Catholic school versus the public school where they taught. Clearly, your parents wanted you to go to college, wanted for you not to maybe struggle as they did. As you said,
Correct.
they struggled making those presentations. In addition to setting you up to go on and to continue with your education, to get a degree, was there ever anything, did they ever say, we'd love you to study this? Or that you should become a teacher, you should become a doctor? Is there any guidance in that way? Or did you have the freedom to kind of go and explore and figure those things out for yourself?
I absolutely had the freedom within the tight constraints of being, in a Catholic family where the parents are very much in charge, where everyone, every adult is, in charge of you as well,
Yeah.
accountable. We were accountable to all adults. So, but within that, as long as I studied hard and did well, they let me,
Oh, I
choose
lost
my
you. I can't hear you.
passions.
Okay.
Can you hear
Let's
me?
see. Try now. I can hear you.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. I just got a little notification that says my My internet is unstable.
Okay.
Let me just do something really quick so that I make sure it doesn't go out. And then we are good. And don't worry, this is the
No, I understand
beautiful,
that.
beautiful edit thing about editing.
Yes.
All right. Okay, so you were talking about how you had the freedom within the constraints of growing up in a Catholic family. Talk to me a little more about that.
Oh, my parents were a modern educated parents. Uh, they very much, wanted to encourage us to blossom into our potential. So they never squelched me at any point. I think the only part was when I entered puberty in junior high and high school and really started thinking for myself. I did come into challenges with my father for adopting feminism early on. And I remember one day, it was in high school, it must have been, I came home with Time or Newsweek magazine, and Gloria Steinem and all her, sunglass visor, tossed blonde hair Glory was on the cover. And I said, Dad, I want to be like this woman. And he had a problem with that because although he always taught me and encouraged me to fight for Chicano rights, per se, which I understood, he had a little more trouble with my feminism because it did disrupt the order of things that, our family life as he was accustomed.
I love that story and the description. I love the description of Gloria Steinem. Um, so you're having these experiences, you're exposed to feminism. What is it that you envision for yourself? What kind of future did you envision for yourself, Dorothea?
I think I had a very vague and kind of soft focus picture of myself because my parents were educated and they both had graduate degrees. And I remember, entering puberty, my father was working on a graduate degree. I believe it was in history and administration at Texas A&I University in Kingsville, which is now part of the Texas A&M system. And we would all, sleep on the floor because it was only a one bedroom apartment and there were several children and, my parents were going to school. So there was always the expectation that I would go to college. But because my parents had gone to local universities at that time, Pan American University, which is now UTRGV, and Texas A&I University, when it came time for me to go to college, they really couldn't give me much guidance. I was high school valedictorian. I had good SAT scores, but there was no real guidance as to which college I would ultimately choose. So I chose four of them that had a good reputation and was accepted to all of them and chose Stanford. And I will go into why I chose Stanford. But there was one high school teacher, and there always is if you're fortunate, that kind of sees who you are and what your potential is. And he was an English teacher, he was white, but he saw how easy it was and how passionate I was about literature. And I remember one time he assigned Christina Rossetti's poem Goblin's Market. And I think he was surprised that I could pick out all the sexual connotations, and really delve deeply into what the poem was alluding to or the reverberations under the language. And so there were many such books that he would give, and he understood that I got him at a deep symbolic level. So he started, a relationship as mentor to me and kind of treated me especially in a way that kind of gave me the confidence to say, you know what, I can go to a good university and I can even perhaps one day become a writer. And it was because of his influence in my life. But again, I had a vague idea of what college was going to be all about. I chose Stanford because they gave me the most financial aid. They gave me a full tuition scholarship, whereas the other
Wow.
three universities did not. They gave me partial scholarships, and my family had 7 children. So I knew that my parents could not afford, except very minimally, to help me. But Stanford also wisely sent a Chicana recruiter from the admissions office. And I think that was another huge factor for me choosing Stanford, because I knew there was someone that was like me in the administration. And I think lastly, I chose Stanford because the brochure and there was the Pacific Ocean, and that was it. But I felt comfortable academically at Stanford, Jay, but I never felt comfortable socially, at least at the beginning, my first couple of years, because truth be told, I'd never been surrounded by so many white students. And my freshman dorm was quote unquote the Native American theme house. And I believe there was about a dozen Native Americans. There was maybe another dozen Chicanos, and there was about 200 white folks. So I think it was, and many of the white folks were affluent too. So they would be going, skiing in Tahoe for spring break, and the Chicano students would be on campus. So I don't think I felt socially comfortable until my junior year, when I moved to the International Theme House, Hammersholt, on campus. And there, everyone was a minority. The Chinese, the Nigerians, the French, the Belgians, the Mexicans, the Peruvians. And I felt for the first time very comfortable at Stanford in that setting. But I spent a lot of time in the Chicana admissions officer's office, and also the financial aid had a Chicana officer. And I spent a lot of time there the first year, not because I needed their help, but just because I felt comfortable. Representation matters. Being able to see yourself in positions of leadership and power, which I had learned from my parents, actually, because their leadership in Valley high schools was so critical for the success of the hundreds of Chicano students, thousands, that they mentored and encouraged to graduate. And alongside, my experience, I had learned from my parents early on the politics of education, that it's not just what you learn in the classroom, but the access to learn that, the comfort level that your teachers give you, the sense of justice or lack thereof. My mother became a junior high counselor. My dad was first a Texas history teacher, and then he became assistant high school principal. And I remember them talking about, cases where they often had to intervene between Chicano students and Anglo teachers. And some of the Anglo teachers, at least one was a member of the John Birch Society, which is the precursor for the Tea Party, the precursor for MAGA. And they had to intervene in kind of conflicts between students, and they took their jobs very seriously. And I think they had the wisdom of Solomon, because they had the gift of hearing both sides and coming to, adjust address of whatever was going on. But they certainly didn't go into meetings or conflicts with the assumption that the white teacher was right. And that was a whole sea change in the Valley when Chicano administrators finally had the reins of power within the high schools.
Wow. I'm appreciating the history lesson. One thing another thing that I wanted to know, here you are, and I understand when you speak to not feeling socially, right?
Mhm.
At home, or feeling like you belong socially on campus at Stanford. I remember feeling a little like that my first year, and until I think I was able to find my community. So I understand that. While you're at Stanford, though, well, first, did your parents have any issue with you leaving the Valley to attend college?
Um, I think they did, naturally, but it was my father who pushed me on the plane, because at the very end, I had never left home. And I realized that it was all kind of dreamy and vague until it was time to get on that plane and go to
Yeah.
California from, Mission, Texas. And he's the one that actually forced me to get on the plane. So, my dad always knew that I had potential to do something with my life, and he wasn't going to let my momentary loss of confidence stop me from, accessing the education that he thought I needed to be who I was intended to be.
Wow, I love that. And did you know you wanted to be a writer when you got to Stanford?
I think, again, I had a vague idea that that was something I wanted to do. I started off as a psychology major at Stanford, but around my junior year, I switched into English literature studies. And I think when you read and write literature all the time, you always have that, little spark in your heart saying, I could do this, and again, the romantic idea of the writer, appealed to me as well. So there was always that lure. But I don't think that I started thinking of myself as a writer until, after graduate school or around graduate school. I went to the University of Texas at Austin, and I won a prize for a poetry collection at the university. So I think at that point, I mean, becoming a writer is kind of an internal developmental thing. It's not just automatic. I mean, I've written my first book, and it's still getting used to the idea I can call myself a writer. It's bona fide now, because there's all sorts of things that go on. I mean, writers, I don't know, have the highest of self-esteems. They're very self-critical. I, having studied brilliant literature, I know what it is. So where do I fit in that panorama? But I think it was my parents' daughter in me that knew that I wanted to give back to my community. I wanted to represent Chicanos. I wanted to talk about what's going on at the border and the use of surveillance, the use of helicopters, the use of dogs, you know, how different my home now feels.
Hmm.
And it was that sense of wanting to represent Chicanos, wanting to speak up for Latinos in general, that made me choose this topic and finish the book and become the writer I had always dreamed of in a vague way, when I was a girl in school.
You're at Stanford, completed degree. It's from Stanford. And you said you went to a study to get your master's degree at UT. Was that immediately after Stanford, or did you work? Did you? And I ask because I think for a lot of the folks that I've interviewed, they talk about as soon as they finish that bachelor's degree, there was an expectation, whether it was from society or from their parents to, okay, now it's time for you to work. What were the expectations for you after you completed your degree?
Well, there were no expectations, but as long as I could support myself, and I found ways to do it. One of the things I did was I was a substitute teacher. I did come back to the Valley for a little bit. So I did support myself, but my parents really didn't, I mean, they never intervened in terms of what we were going to do with our lives or who we were going to love. They were kind of like very hands off in that way, gave us a lot of space to truly make our own adult decisions. So I think I was out for maybe a couple of years, 2 years or so before I went to graduate school.
And what is it that led you to UT?
I don't quite know. I mean, it was Austin. It was, it's the flagship university in Texas. Um, they had a fine English program. There were many reasons, but this time I wanted to stay in Texas. I think that was part of it. I didn't want to go back to California for my graduate degree. So those are some of the reasons. And Right after that, I met someone at UT that recruited me to post-graduation, entered the English department at Texas A&I at Kingsville. And I began my professional career as an English teacher at Texas A&I, which is now Texas A&M at Kingsville.
Hmm. Tell me about your time at Texas.
My time at Texas was, graduate school is a very different um, world than the very intense world of undergraduate school. So I had, a couple of Chicano friends in the English department, um, and I had very good professors. Um, but I think that the most intense part of anyone's education post high school is the undergraduate education. It was a little bit, it wasn't as monumental in terms of, challenging me socially or psychologically. I think I had come into my own. And so I was more self-aware as to what I was doing and what I was preparing myself for. But it was a wonderful experience. I mean, both at Stanford and at UT Austin, uh, by and large, they were great experiences, but there were, there were elements of racism that I encountered or prejudice. Um, in isolated incidents, things that professors would say or administrators would say to me, that made me see that these were not beacons of justice in their purity. They also had their own challenges for Chicano students.
These experiences, whether it's at Stanford or UT, you're having these experiences, and right, maybe they didn't color your entire time, right, in these places, but at any point, did you ever experience the sort of self-doubt where you were questioning, should I be here? Should I continue down this path?
Uh, I would say not. I would say not. I remember at Stanford, at the first in my junior year, the fall semester, I had applied for study abroad in Spain, in Salamanca. And I was accepted, but I needed more financial aid and to be able to do it. And, I did graduate with loans, but anyway, at any rate, I went to the financial aid office and I remember it was a white officer, man, who told me that Stanford was too good for, your kind of people in terms of too generous financially. And, I had a similar experience at UT Austin where um, I had a few incompletes at one time, and I had similar doubts cast on me by, I don't know if it was admissions or an advisor, but kind of doubted that I would pull it together. And I knew that I could pull it together. Life had happened and I was dealing with other things in my personal life. But, finally it was one professor who said, I know you'll pull this together. And I did. And I graduated on time and all courses complete. So while, voices outside me, might have questioned my place in these hallowed institutions, I don't think I ever did, although there were moments of vulnerability.
In my own journey, the first time I say that I was aware that I experienced racism was while I was at Stanford and while I was an undergrad. And I remember feeling like I couldn't talk to my parents about it because I
Mhm.
don't know it was that I wanted to shelter them from it, or that I didn't know if they could help me. But I struggled with sort of the thoughts and the experience and kind of making sense of it. Going and speaking, for example, to this person, financial aid, and hearing those words, whether it's that moment or any other moment where you experienced racism, some form of racism, What was that process like for you? Did you have somebody that you spoke to about it? Did you kind of just sit with it, or was it just, I just need to push past this?
I think it was, I just need to push past this. I did have, friends and Chicanos, mostly Chicano friends at Stanford. So I did have a support group. And then again, there was the admissions officer and the financial aid officer that were Chicanas. But I think a lot of students of color, persons of color are very familiar with those. I guess the term now is microaggressions, where you just, you take the little scratch and you move on. Because again, I always felt comfortable at Stanford. In fact, I graduated Phi Beta Kappa. So I was academically, I knew that I belonged there. But, those kind of microaggressions, and there were others. I remember, again, in the Native American theme house dorm, a white student came up to me and told me that the coat I was wearing offended his sensibilities and I needed to buy a new one. So it was those kind of, my parents, other than flying me home for um, once a year, I don't even think I went home for Christmas during my time at Stanford. They couldn't really afford to give a lot because they had six other children, and I believe my alien grandparents were also living with them at some point. So I think I just learned, Jay, as many students of color learn, how to take those kind of microaggressions and just keep moving forward. And I was also fortunate, I think, that I knew Chicanos at Stanford that were very political and politically active. And I remember when he was a boy, he was a couple of years older than I, and he was a self-avowed communist, you know, and he once asked me why I thought I was at Stanford, and I quite naively, I was, I think, a freshman, answered, "Well, it's because I'm smart." And he says, "No, that's not why you're at Stanford. You're at Stanford because your Chicano brothers and sisters fought for you to be at Stanford. That's why you're at Stanford." Stanford has, at that time, had always been saying to the Chicano students, there aren't any more. We've looked the country over and there's very few Chicanos that can cut the grade here. And the Chicano students that were older would say, send us and we'll find them. So I think, Jay, that statement from an older student, it just knocked the rest of the stupid out of me. It knocked the stupid out of me. I never made that glib assumption again that the reason I'm here is my own merit. That was partly true, but the longer I was at Stanford, the more I saw the political activism that even, pushed the administration to look for qualified Chicanos, and I would assume other minorities. I remember one particular student, the Chicano students, we used to drive home because we wouldn't even fly. We'd drive home, six of us piled up in a car, and we'd rush past West Texas because we were nervous. But I remember one of my fellow students was a farm worker and came from a farm working family, and she was out acing the preppies in mathematics. So it was those kind of things that made me see that Chicanos and others we've always had the ability to do things, but unless there's the political muscle behind it, those doors might have been forever closed. And now I look at my other alma mater, UT Austin, and the destruction of DEI as so-called, the fact that you can't use the words women in any titles or Latino, Chicano in any course titles. That's shocking to me. That's shocking to me. And that just shows me we're going to have to come together as a community and start using that political muscle.
I love where sort of we find ourselves in this conversation for a number of reasons, right? Because I think I've shared this with others where I think it's so easy to forget
And some of us never learn. We never know. We never hear, right? We don't always get the opportunity to get the stupid knocked out of us.
Yeah.
And so to remember to learn about the work that has gone in before us, that so many, that countless have done before us to create these opportunities that you were able to take advantage of, that I was clearly able to take advantage of, and then to find ourselves where we are today. And your book, and why you've written your book, I mean, you've talked about sort of the surveillance that this community, that the community that your parents grew up in now finds itself under.
Hmm.
What is it? So tell us about, walk us through, if you don't mind, the genesis of the book, why you felt the need to tell this story.
Well, again, it was visiting South Texas, visiting these pueblos in Hidalgo County that I grew up in. And I think as an adult, I would return. I'm a transplanted Tejana in California, but every couple of years, especially when my parents were alive, I would go see them at least every other year. And even after they passed away, I would want to go and clean their graves, the Mexican custom of tending the graves. So I was on such a mission in 2021. And I knew I had already decided I was going to write a book. And I knew that I wanted to write about my childhood in these little magical pueblos along the river because they were so meaningful to me. Um, but it was seeing the surveillance, it was seeing the wall that kind of, like, as I said, you know, steeled my resolve to finish this first book. And again, this was, I'm retired. It took me this long to have the space and time to be able to focus on a writing project. And I knew that I had to choose something that had deep passion. I had deep passion for, so that I would be able to finish it. But it was a love letter to my childhood, to the good people who raised me, especially in the current circumstances where there is so much inhumanity going on at the border. The militarization, the use of violence for political motives, uh, the way that Latinos are characterized by MAGA, and other, the Trump administration. I felt like I wanted to, and I think of myself as a Tejana Jedi and use my pen, you know, to fight the swords because the swords are out.
Yeah.
And I think it's time for us writers and all the writers that, with social consciousness about the plight of, Chicanos on the border, the plight of immigrants, to raise their voices, because we're going to need those Jedi warriors to counteract the narratives, the deadly narratives that are being spun around our people and communities.
Hmm. I appreciate you saying that. I think so much of, and I absolutely agree. I think so much of the work that needs to be done is again the telling of stories, right? And taking ownership of our stories and sharing them, because these narratives are incredibly powerful. And I think about myself and growing up in my community, and I often write about how I didn't learn about myself and I didn't really learn about my community until I left, until I was at Stanford, and I was encouraged to kind of explore. But I was also reading authors who were from the area who I'd never heard of. And I remember feeling, again, as I shared, it for me, it was like relearning. It was
Mhm.
learning history that I didn't know, that I had never been shared with me. And so absolutely telling the stories, telling our stories, I think is more critical than ever. So
I
thank you.
agree.
Yeah, thank you
Thank
for
you.
putting your stories together, and for telling the stories that need to be told.
And need to be heard because, the fact that all four counties, um, in the valley went for Trump is shocking to me, and shows how much education, or shall we say, as you say, re-education, we have to do, even of our own people.
Mhm.
In my way of thinking, I understand that there's all sorts of political perspectives, but to share with Chicano Latino students the beauty of our history and to elevate the beauty of our cultural values when we are being so devalued, by the political discourse.
Dorotea, thank you. Thank you for telling your stories, and thank you for writing this book. Thank you for sharing your story with me today. Before you go, I always ask my guests to leave us with a piece of advice, some words of wisdom. So what would you like to leave our listeners with today?
Well, I think if I'm speaking to students of whatever age that have a story to tell and would like to enter the world of being a writer, to have faith in yourself and to prioritize being a writer. I think that if I could talk to my younger self, I would have told her, follow your passion, follow your gifts, and don't be distracted by love relationships or family or making a living. Make all those things secondary if you can to your gift, and I think it took me this long to write my first book. And that's just the way it turned out in my life. But I feel like, hold on to your gifts, the things that make you you, and, cherish them and nurture them, and don't let anyone dissuade you from those dreams.
I love that. That's well said. Thank you.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate this time. Thank you.
No, I really, I'm the fortunate one. I'm the lucky one that gets to sit here and listen to these wonderful stories and your journey, and I'm excited to share it with the world. Dorotea, thank you. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for your story. And thank you for your contributions. So I'm excited to share your work, and I'll make sure to put a link. Anything that you'd like me to share about your book, please just forward it to me so that I can share that with
I will.
our listeners out there. All right. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. This concludes another episode of the Way to College podcast. Thank you to my guests. Thank you to our listeners out there. Please remember to subscribe, rate, follow the podcast, and do me a favor and share the podcast with one other person. I'd appreciate it. We'll talk again soon. Thank you, and bye-bye.